At that time, I think she was already pretty deaf. But she had, maybe she developed this other senses, because she could spot, if she went out to the street and she saw they are stopping people for their papers, she had eyes like, I don't know, but she was very sharp. And right away she would turn the other way and go the other way. And she many times she escaped these little checks that they did. And so because of her resourcefulness, because I had to think what would have happened if she could have been stopped herself when she was outside for food. But she was okay. And when the Russians liberated us, there was some tense period because the Germans were still there. And I remember they were saying, the Germans were saying, if we see one Russian soldier, we're going to blow up this whole place. And the Russians were saying, if we'll see one German, we'll blow up this whole place. So we all knew that liberation is right there, but there were some really scary times when they were threatening us from both ends. And then somehow it was time to leave, and that was very stressful, because not to mention when we walked back toward my grandmother's old apartment, we walked, there was no transportation whatsoever, the city was in shambles, so it was a long walk, but we could walk back. And there were bodies on the street, and my grandmother was shielding my eyes. She didn't want me to see so many times. We would approach a body, she would just shield my eyes. And of course, the big stress was, and the agony, are we going to even find that building there? We didn't know, because half the city was bombed. So the big stress was, are we going to find the building, and are we going to find my great-grandmother? Maybe my mother came back, maybe my father. We didn't know anything at all. And we went back to the building, and luckily everything was there. The building was undamaged, and my great-grandmother was there. So that reunion was wonderful. Apparently she came back from the ghetto first before we got there. So that reunion was wonderful. But then on the other hand, nobody knew, nobody heard what had become of my mother and my father.
When was this?
This was spring 1945, March, and then April passed and May passed, and still no word. People started to come back from the concentration camps. Slowly, this came back and that came back, and we started to hear stories of the horrible things that were going on before, because we really didn't know. We were so cut away from everything. And slowly people started to come back, but still no sign of my parents. And at one point someone came back, a woman, and she came to my grandmother's house, and she said that she was in the group with my mother, and she was certain that my mother died. She said she saw her die. And that was, of course, horrible news. I mean, everybody was heartbroken, everybody was crying day and night. And the woman who came, I don't remember her name, and I don't even remember if she was a close friend. I think she just happened to be in the group that my mother was. And my mother gave her a little ticket. It was a movie theater ticket that she must have found on the street, or maybe it was in her pocket. And she scribbled on it a message to my grandmother, and the message was, "Mother, don't leave me." And I remember that was just about breaking my grandmother's heart, and they held on to that little ticket for quite a long time. I don't know what happened to it, but and I remember feeling just kind of very, of course, upset, but still didn't grasp it. I guess I was 6 and not quite 6 yet, and I really didn't understand fully what does it mean, somebody dies, I'll never see her again. So I remember that feeling that everybody was crying around me, and I said to myself, I should be crying too. And maybe the tears just didn't come at that time. I guess I didn't really fully understand what was going on. But that was pretty clear to us that my mother died, since there was a witness who came back and she told us. And of course the hope, they couldn't kill that hope that maybe she's wrong, maybe she didn't die. And that hope was with us, I don't know, till I was an adult. That hope always stays.
How old was your mother?
My mother was 26. She was a child herself. And she was only 20 when I was born. And she was very young. And it was kind of interesting that her last note was addressed to her mother and not to her husband, not to me. That just shows how young she was really. She was really a child herself. So that was kind of interesting that the last note was addressed to her mother.
And do you know anything more about her death, how she died, where she died?
The woman told us that she was not very fit. She was not very athletic. She was kind of a dainty, very thin to start with. And they were marched many days and many weeks, and they were not given proper food, and everybody got very, very thin. And the people who were stronger, maybe in spirit and body, they would exercise and try to just stay fit somehow better. And she just wasn't that strong. And the way they told me, and I don't know if this is the truth or maybe they wanted to spare me, the way that I was given the picture that she just kind of collapsed on the wayside and she died. So as a child I didn't have these terrible memories that she died, who knows how. So I always just saw this picture in my mind that they were marching and my mother just collapsed and died. And only later on, when I got a little older, I had these terrible thoughts that who knows how she died. I mean, she was very beautiful. She was pretty, and she was young, and who knows? She could have been tortured, or don't want to even think about that. And so that's all the details that we got. And then, because the place that she died was called Lichtenwörth, and it is in Czechoslovakia, we received notification that they gathered the remains of all the people who died in Lichtenwörth, and they brought it back on a big truck to Budapest, and they buried her in this, what they call a common grave, because they couldn't separate. There was no way to really tell who's who, but they believed that she was among them. And then I remember going to the cemetery, and in fact when I go and visit now in Hungary, I go to the cemetery and we replace, there's a little tiny plaque, but there's a big stone that says, "Here lie the martyrs of Lichtenwörth." And it's fairly easy to find because there is a record, as long as I knew where she died. If I wouldn't have known where she died, that would have been hard. And the first time we went back there, after many, many years, we had a hard time finding it, but because the letters were kind of washed away from her name. And then I ordered a new, just recently, maybe about 7 years ago when we were back, I ordered a new writing on the letter, so it's pretty clear now. And that's all we could do. Just believe that she was among those, and she was buried in that common grave. And after that, we still did not know much about my father, because it seemed like everybody came back and there was still no word from him. And my grandmother went back. She had a store, a beauty parlor, right across from the Hungarian opera. And it was a very nice little shop. All the singers from the opera came there, and so she had a business, and that's how she supported us. Luckily, that whole house stayed there. Her business was in the same house where her apartment was. And I remember being kind of neglected at that time. I remember roaming the streets with other children. There was really no one to look after me. My great-grandmother, I guess she was okay. She could make the meals. She cooked, but she was not really strong enough to tell me what to do. So I remember being kind of a street child, just roaming the streets. And once we even got in trouble. There was a shop that was, somebody shattered the glass, and we went in the shop, and the police came to my grandmother's apartment saying that I was part of this street gang or something really. I mean, it was really terrible. And my grandmother was kind of at a loss because she had to work, and she really didn't know how to raise me, how to solve this problem. But very shortly after that, I remember that once I came back from playing on the streets, and there was this strange man in our kitchen, sitting and talking to my grandmother. And I really couldn't recognize him, but turned out it was my father. He was totally skin and bones. He had this big beard. And after he started talking, I recognized the voice, that indeed it was my father. And turns out that he was liberated, but he was so ill, he was so sick, that they transferred him to some hospital. And it took him many months to recover and come back to us. And when they let him go and he came back and he found out that my mother died, he was just heartbroken. And he was so sad and angry at the same time that he even lashed out at my grandmother, and he blamed her. Why couldn't you bribe them? Why couldn't you give them the whole box of jewelry, every single piece we had? You should have done this, you should have done that. And my poor grandmother, who was already grieving because of that, so she was in a difficult spot. But I think later on he realized it's silly to blame her, my goodness. And he had to settle down somehow and find us a way to continue. Apparently the apartment that we had, my mother and father and myself, was not available. Some Hungarians took it over and we couldn't go back there. That was gone. So my father had to stay with my grandmother. Now here we were already, so many people living there, in 2 rooms. That was my great-grandmother, my grandmother, myself, my father, and my mother's brother. My mother only had one brother who came back from the war. He was in a concentration camp also. He came back just before my father did, and he was already living in that back room. So in the 1 bedroom, it was, now my father was sharing it with my uncle. His name was Rezső. He was just a year younger than my mother was. And in the big room, in the living room, it was my great-grandmother, my grandmother, and myself sharing that. So we were tight. And this must have continued for quite a long time, because I remember the whole summer passing, 1945, the whole summer we were like that. And I even started school, and at that time I turned almost 7. And we were still living in that situation. And my father and my uncle did not get along. They were just fighting all the time. They tried to get into some business together, and that didn't go very well. And times were pretty rough. And I remember getting sick at that time. That was the time that all of a sudden I got all the childhood diseases. I got the mumps. I remember getting the mumps and being in that little bed in the living room, my grandmother taking care of me, and my great-grandmother, they both took care of me. And then I got some sort of measles. And at that time I remember just getting sick a lot. And somehow in the fall, that could be probably at least October or November, my father was successful finding an apartment. And he took me away from my grandmother, and the two of us went to this apartment. And that was kind of strange for me, because my father was a little bit of a stranger. I mean, all of a sudden he looked different. He was very nervous. He was upset, obviously. He was not even that well. So I remember just kind of staying out of his way. He was always very kind to me. He was really always very, very nice to me. But I just wasn't that comfortable with him.
Did he tell you about what had happened to him?
Oh, yes. He told us stories, even when I was living with my grandmother. He just went on and on. He could talk for hours. He could talk for hours, and I remember neighbors coming in and just kind of sitting around the table, and we're listening to his stories. He was taken to Mauthausen, and he was one of those strong and luckily resourceful people who somehow managed to stay alive. There was one period when he was in Mauthausen that he considered his lucky period, when he was put to work in the kitchen. And that was just about the best place you can be, because even if they didn't let you eat, of course, everything there was, but he could gather, for example, the peels from the potatoes, and he could hide it and put it away in his pocket. So he always was very careful to hide some food for later. He always had this thought, oh, maybe later I won't have enough. So he was always putting things away. And then later, when he did not work in the kitchen, and they gave him, for example, they would give him one piece of bread to last the whole day, and some other people were so hungry they would just gobble it up all at once. He made sure that he cut that in 3 parts, and he'll have a morning, and he'll have a noon, and he'll have an evening. And he just had so many stories how he could survive. I wish those stories would have been recorded, because I unfortunately don't remember much of it. I just remember a little bit here and there. And there was some story that they escaped and they tried to catch a chicken. And somehow they caught a chicken, and that was such a big deal. And they had some meat. And each time he escaped, they somehow caught him and they took him back to the camp. And he was down to I'm sure, I don't know, 100 pounds or something like that. And he caught every disease. He had tuberculosis, and he had, his heart was bad, and he was just very sick. But basically, he always told me that his luck was that he came from very healthy parents. And he was basically a very healthy person, otherwise he wouldn't have been able to survive. Even when they were liberated, he said that was a very dangerous time, because a lot of his friends they overate, because people came and they really didn't know that when they offered the prisoners food, that they have to be careful, just give them a little bit at a time. And these people they were so starved that they just ate, and their stomach couldn't handle it, and many of them got either very, very sick, or some of them even died. And I remember my father keeping in touch with a lot of his, there's a term in Hungarian, it's called bajtárs, which translates to friend in trouble. And they would meet afterwards, and he would just casually talk about it. He's my bajtárs. And so he survived. It wasn't easy. It was pretty terrible, but he survived, and he came back so very sick. And unfortunately, the tuberculosis that he picked up didn't completely go away, and came back. So after we were together in the apartment, my father and I, he caught it again, and it came back full speed. And this was 1946 summer. And at that time, he met a woman who later on became my stepmother. And that woman was very young, and from what I understand, she looked a lot like my mother. She was also skinny, had the same hair coloring. And so when my father saw her the first time, the resemblance was so startling that he fell in love with her. And she came to live with us eventually. First she was kind of my governess only, and then she moved in with us. And when he became so sick, my father became so sick with tuberculosis, the doctors were saying that it really wasn't safe for me to stay there, that I really shouldn't. And at that time there was no medication, no good medication for it. That the antibiotics came out a little bit later. And the only thing to do was to send me away. And I was just barely, maybe half a year with him in that apartment when they decided to send me away to the country. Apparently I had an uncle who had some really good friends, and they had a young girl who was my age. She was also 7. And they figured rather than me going back to my grandmother's, where there is really nobody to take care of me, my grandmother was working, I'd be better off if they send me to this strange family that I've never seen before. I, of course, didn't want to go, but they told me I had to, so they put me on this train. It was a distance from Budapest. The place was called Sárvár. And it was about 3 hours from Budapest with a train toward the Austrian border. And I arrived to this family thinking that maybe I won't have to stay that long, but it actually was much longer than I was hoping for. It ended up being 1.5 years. And I became friendly with a girl. Her name was Jutka. She was nice, and we were the same age. We went to the same school, and we kind of became friendly. And her parents it was an Orthodox family, Jewish Orthodox family. So this was my first time I came in full contact with Orthodox Jews, and I learned everything. The Friday night and the Saturday, and then we baked challah every Friday. I helped them. And we went to the synagogue, so they were religious. And I remember my mother died, and I never called anybody mother, and somehow this Jutka's mother wanted me to call her mother. And they asked me several times, and I couldn't. I just couldn't. So I don't know what I called her, but I sure did not call her mother. And the school we went to second grade, was pretty horrible. It was a little school in the country. It was a regular public school. And all the grades were, I think, together. And the teachers were hitting us with a ruler. They had all kinds of punishment when we didn't know this, we didn't know that. We had to hold up our hands like that, and they would hit us here because that would hurt more. Or they had another place they would hold up our palm up, and they would hit us on the palm, or we had to kneel on corn. They would take corn on the front of the classroom, and we would have to kneel on it for every little reason. So it was not an ideal place to be. But that was the only school, so I had to go there.
Let's stop here. Ramaty. You were telling me about your life in the country with the family.
Right. So my life in the country sounds like it's so glamorous and wonderful. This was not that glamorous, unfortunately. It wasn't that they were not good to me. They were very nice people, but I still felt like an outsider, like a stranger. And I remember writing letters to my father all the time, asking when can come home and can I come home. The family's name was Berkowitz. I don't remember their first name, but we kept in touch later on. We both ended up in Israel, and I did go and visit them once. They lived in Haifa. But my father, I think, visited me once during that year and a half that I was in Sharvar. And at that time he said the doctors did not approve yet, but it won't be long. And then they sent for me when I was, I think, 8 and a half. I came back to Budapest. And that was really a wonderful reunion. I really loved coming back to the apartment in Budapest and being with my father and my stepmother also, who was not my stepmother yet. They did not marry until much later, but she lived with us and I just considered her as part of the family now. I did see my aunt occasionally. That was the aunt that hid me, Boris. And unfortunately, her husband never came back, so she was a widow. And she was living alone in her apartment, but she was managing all right. I think she continued the business. She was also in the produce business. And she had enough jewelry and pictures and whatever that she could just sell, and so she managed okay. And occasionally she visited me, I visited her, so we kept in touch. And when I came back to the city, somehow, slowly, life became more normal. I went to a better school. It was still a public school, but because we were missing, I was missing a grade. I was one grade behind. They put me in an accelerated class, and that gave me a good feeling because all of a sudden it was a smaller class. When I just started school, we were something like 60 children in a classroom. I was way back. Nobody paid attention to me. It was pretty terrible. But slowly things started to become normal. My father started to work for this Russian factory. It was a canning factory. It was out of just a little bit outside of Budapest. It was called Dunakeszi. And he had a high position for them, with them. He was a director, so he managed very well. And we still had a little weekend house, that same weekend house that he bought for my mother way back, and we went up to the mountain, which was not very far away. It was in Pest, which was just the other side of Budapest. And we were living in Pest, and the weekend house was in Buda, in the mountainy part. And we set it up so that it was almost like a second residence, because it was so pretty there, and my father loved going up there, that every weekend, every Friday, we would pack our things and stay there till Monday. And in fact, the year after that, I was in 4th grade. My father had a relapse, and we had to stay in the mountain, in the weekend place, for a longer period of time. And unfortunately, I caught it from him. And they didn't know if I caught it from him or it was not a full tuberculosis yet, but it was the beginning of it. It was a disease that's called, in Hungarian, it's called hilus. And I don't really know exactly the name in English, but what they explained to me that it's a little growth in the lung. And the only cure for that was to lie still in bed and not to move. And that was long term, lying in bed. So school started and we went back to the city, but I really couldn't go to school. I was lying on my back most of the time. And then some of the time they sent me to this sanatorium for tuberculosis patients or other lung diseases. I think it was called the lung sanatorium. And they were very careful with me. So I just had to rest. That was the only thing. And that was not that easy for a young child to be in bed all the time. And when I was back in the apartment, I remember in the winter, because they said I had to have fresh air, they would put me out in the balcony. And it was winter, so they covered me up so it won't snow on me. And my face was just a little uncovered. So that was pretty rough. And even when I went back to school finally, they always measured that little growth. When it was very small, they said I could go back to school. And if it got a little bigger, then I had to rest again. So when I went back to school again, I had to be exempt from gym, and I had to be exempt for anything, any kind of physical activity. I was not allowed to go in the sun or the stuff that they told me. My father was actually cured because at that time the medication was available. I had an aunt, one of my aunts lived in America. She lived in San Francisco. She left way before the war. They left Hungary in the 1930s. So they lived in Vienna for a while and they went to San Francisco. And she sent streptomycin to my father, and that was the proper medication for tuberculosis. So he was okay. He was cured. Well, cured as much as possible. And they had to be just very careful with me, so I won't get sick, and I had that disease. But I got somehow better too, and life more or less became normal for about a year or so. And there was a lot of unrest in Budapest at that time. The communists were in power, and they gave us a lot of heartache and trouble, and again, especially the Jewish people. What happened was there was a tremendous shortage of apartments, and the Russians wanted the apartments. So they came out with this rule or regulation. It was not necessarily against Jews. It was not mentioned that it was against Jews, but somehow most of the people who got this were Jews, and what they got, that there was a little letter that was delivered to them, and the letter said, you have to vacate your apartment in 24 hours, just 24 hours, and you have to go, and they specified where you had to go. You couldn't just go anywhere. You had to go to this teeny little village in the country where many times there was no electricity, no running water, just a pretty terrible place. And this famous letter arrived to many people that we knew. So my father again had to make some sort of a decision and decide, what are we going to do? We have to do something. We can't just stand by. And he decided he'll put in the papers and we should go to Israel. And that wasn't that easy either. They didn't let people just like that. So they said, this was the communist government, that they will allow, at that time, that was 1951, they will allow 2,000 people to go to Israel. And so we put in the papers, and for some odd reason, they let me, and they did not let my father. They let my aunt. This is the very same aunt who saved me during the war. They let her too. So she and I, again, were somehow thrown together because my father decided that, yes, I should leave, even though he would have to stay behind, and he'll try to come after me as soon as he could. And he was telling me that it will probably be 2 months. And believing that, somehow I agreed to go, not knowing that those 2 months will stretch to 6 years. And we went to Israel. I went with my aunt, and that was again kind of stressful because they didn't let us take just anything we wanted. They told everybody who was in this 2,000 people that they were allowed up to a certain value, and they evaluate everything you take with you, even your clothes. This is so much value, this is so